Okay. Hello and welcome. My name is Kim Dovey and I'm co-director of the Informal Urbanism Research Hub here known as InfUr. And we'll be hosting this seminar this afternoon with Professor Michael Smith. I want first of all to acknowledge that this seminar takes place on the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in Melbourne. And I pay my respects to their elders and to all Indigenous people, both here and on the Native American lands in Phoenix, Arizona, from where this seminar will be presented. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Michael E. Smith. It's important we get the Michael and the E in there because there's a lot of Smiths even in the archaeology discipline. Michael is a professor of archaeology and director of the Teotihuacan Research Laboratory at Arizona State University. Mike is an expert in Aztec archaeology with a particular interest in the urban life of ancient cities. And he's long been interested in looking beyond the pyramids, the palaces, and the plazas that are the evidence of state power that we know so well, to also understand the ordinary urban neighbourhoods that often precede the state. He's also a multidisciplinary scholar who's published many comparative studies, comparing not just ancient cities with each other, but also the pre-modern with the modern, and connecting the dots on the big urban issues such as density, sustainability, informality. His presentation today will be a preview from the forthcoming book, which is entitled Urban Life in the Distant Past, The Prehistory of Energized Crowding, which will be Cambridge University Press very soon, I think, within a month or two. Mike will talk for up to 40 minutes and then we'll have some discussion. So if you have a question on Zoom, please just leave your name on the chat box and we will take them in order. If you are on Zoom, please ensure that you are muted unless you're called to ask a question. So over to Mike.
Thanks very much, Kim. It's an honor to be here and I look forward to discussing things with you folks. And I am going to share my screen. And so, does that look right?
Yes.
It does.
Hide the floating. Okay. So I'm an archaeologist, so I want to just start off with different kinds of archaeology. Monumental archaeology, old-time archaeology, going out and digging the big monuments, bringing back things for European museums, basically focusing on the kings and elites, the 1% in the ancient past. Monumental archaeology continues today. At Egypt here, or here's some people opening a tomb at a Maya site, doing the same kind of things that archaeologists did a century or two ago in various parts of the world. But and this original monumental archaeology was associated with what we might call a statist view of the past, that early kings were all powerful. They tried to control all aspects of their of the lives of their subjects. Pyramids were built by slaves, and the state was everything and controlled everything. The kind of archaeology I do, I would call social archaeology, and excavating houses where people lived and fields and workshops and things, and trying to figure out daily life of people in the past. And so here's just a quick historical diagram: contemporary monumental archaeology, social archaeology. When I was socialized in archaeology, generative processes were not really discussed. It really wasn't, I mean, the state was everything. We wanted to figure out states and elites, and people didn't really have much agency. We didn't worry too much about them. But in more recently, sort of generative processes, bottom-up forces have taken on a greater emphasis in archaeology. So I'm going to start off talking about how that came about. One was the overturning the origin myth of democracy. It used to be thought that all kings were despots, like Yul Brynner here. Well, sorry, Ramses II. And then the Greeks invented democracy. But we now know that actually autocratic rule and more collective or democratic rule is more of a continuum. And there were democratic or collective regimes before the Greeks. and the Greeks weren't the only ones. And this book by Blanton and Farger was a major force in bringing about this viewpoint. And they had a sample of 30 societies they studied, from the most autocratic, intermediate, and to the most collective, like classical Athens and Rome or Renaissance Venice. Second sort of transition to a generative approach was overturning the myth of the origin of cities. I recall in my early career that the state was everything. How did the state arise? Well, population, leaders, war, whatever. Oh, cities, yeah, they sort of came along with the state. They're just sort of a byproduct of state formation. Justin Jennings' book, Killing Civilization, presents a model that has cities coming before states. It says people came together for protection and defense. Population size and density caused problems, which we know quite a bit about today. And people also had an aversion to hierarchy and inequality. Early cities were chaotic places, and many of them didn't survive. And states developed in order to deal with some of the problems generated by people living in cities. So in his view, states were a byproduct of life in cities. He studies several examples, Chatalhuyuk, and so on, that were around for a while, then they collapsed. They didn't develop states. But others, like Tiwanaku in South America or Monte Alban, state institutions did develop. Another factor is a growing focus on households and neighborhoods. When I was in graduate school, this book came out, The Early Mesoamerican Village, edited by Clint Flannery, promoted a household focus. And basically, I decided that's what I want to do with my career. And so that's what I've done. I've directed excavations at a number of Aztec provincial sites. These are not pyramids and tombs. It's not real exciting stuff, but I think it's pretty cool. And I wrote a book about it in 2016, At Home with the Aztecs. An archaeologist uncovers their daily life, which won a prize for the best popular book in archaeology of that year for the Society for American Archaeology. Neighborhoods, sometimes neighborhoods are created by authorities in a top-down approach, as in Tang period Chang'an here. And sometimes neighborhoods are generated by the people themselves. This is the Maya city of Tikal, and we used spatial clustering to identify neighborhoods at Tikal. And of course, Tikal is famous for being the setting for the first Star Wars movie at the end of the movie there. Another influence on bringing about generative approaches, complex adaptive systems, complexity theory. Patterns at higher levels emerge from local interactions at things at the lower level. And Philip Anderson's book, More is Different. And the implication here is that increases in size bring about qualitative changes in a system. So larger cities have properties that are not present in smaller cities. And some of these concepts in archaeology, emergence, self-organization, innovation, methods of scaling and power laws, agent-based modeling networks are all sort of based on a generative approach. So what happens when people aggregate in cities, whether it's in the past or the present? I mean, things happen, and social things happen, economic things happen. And one of the results is what Spiro Kostoff called energized crowding. This is my diagram of what energized crowding is. When population growth and population density increase and people are moving into cities, you have greater face-to-face social interaction, and this has various outcomes. Scalar stress, which is the stresses of dealing with greater numbers of people. Community formation, such as formation of neighborhoods, and economic growth. Now, the economic growth, one manifestation of this, this is my book that's, I finally got my copies in the mail a couple of weeks ago, Urban Life in the Distant Past, the Prehistory of Energized Crowding. I use that concept, energized crowding, to sort of tie the chapters in the book together. And then urban scaling analysis, which developed partly out of complexity science and urban economics and economic geography. And I'm not going to say too much about it here, except that scholars have noticed quantitative relationships between the sizes of cities within a given urban system and the properties of those cities. And Luis Betancourt, in paper in Science 10 years ago now, came up with a rather precise quantitative model for how growth in the size of cities within a given system influences other characteristics. And he came up with quantitative predictions based on the cost of movement in the built environment and economic benefits of individual interactions. And Betancourt and others found some of these relationships in contemporary cities. And then some of us got together and looked at scaling in historic and archaeological cities. So this in medieval Europe, 14th century towns, we had a sample of almost 200 towns where we had both populations from censuses, and we had the areas from various maps. And what we found was that when you take the log of population, the log of area, area increases in what we call a sublinear fashion. In other words, if a city is twice as big as another city in that system, it doesn't have twice the area, it has less than twice the area because it's sublinear. And what that means is large cities within a given system are denser than small cities. And so this has been found for contemporary cities, medieval cities. We formed a project, Luis Betancourt, Jose Lobo, an economist and a complexity scientist, and myself and Scott Ortman, who was the first archaeologist to apply this approach. And we found a bunch of cases that conform to Luis Betancourt's predictions, from Peru to China to the US, Roman Empire, medieval Europe. We found a few cases that don't work, such as the classic Maya, and require a different kind of explanation. But the thing about urban scaling, though, is it's based on people interacting in the built environment. It's based on generative processes and certainly not top-down processes. So these are 5 things that have led to a greater appreciation of generative processes by archaeologists. So let's start with top-down institutions, and then we'll get to the generative processes in a little bit here. You can do anything you set your mind to when you have vision, determination, and an endless supply of expendable labor. Political institutions and processes, the kinds of regimes, city-states, territorial states, and empires, the nature of fiscal organization, taxation, corvée labor, the nature of collective versus autocratic governance, as Blanton and Farger talked about. All of these things sort of set parameters for urban life and how things operate in cities. This paper I published a number of years ago, Form and Meaning in the Earliest Cities, is basically taking the view that that early cities, that the civic architecture of early cities was a top-down imposition by rulers and elites. And I was trying to get away from the idea that if a city is orthogonal, it's planned, and if it's not, it's unplanned. That was sort of the standard view, well, still is in some quarters today. I came up with a model that's applicable to a variety of ancient cities, using spatial coordination among buildings, simple coordination, orthogonality, formality, and so on. And you can you can look at the degree and nature of planning, and it doesn't have to be an orthogonal grid. And a pattern I suggested was that in Mesoamerican cities, here back to Tikal here, major public architecture is located in a central area, which we call the epicenter, and epicenters are carefully planned. Residential areas are not centrally planned. Now, this may look a little bit sloppy, but they're actually principles of symmetry and balance and coordination among the civic architecture here in the middle of Tikal. If you go out away from the central epicenter there, the neighborhood areas are not centrally planned. I mean, they're following more or less a similar orientation, most of these structures. These are mostly house structures. But this is, this is not an orthogonal layout by any means. There's no streets here either. Same principle. These are a couple of Aztec sites I excavated in the 80s, and it turns out these are the only Aztec settlements and some of the very few settlements in Mesoamerica where the entire settlement has been mapped, all the houses. It has to do with the nature of preservation and erosion at these sites. Capilco is a village site, 20 houses. Cuescomate is a town site, 150 houses. And it also has a small epicenter with a couple of elite residences and a temple laid out around a formal plaza. So those buildings in the epicenter there are planned and coordinated with respect to one another. But as you can see, the rest of the housing is just sort of scattered around following the topography of this ridge. City is a practical machine. Kevin Lynch's model from his book Good City Form, which I love this model and I use it quite a bit in my teaching. Residential settlement constructed by a powerful institution for a specific practical purpose. It's sort of the quintessential top-down planning of settlements, to allocate land and resources quickly and to isolate the settlement. We have examples in the ancient world. Some of the best examples are the Egyptian workers' villages, Amarna here and Deir el-Medina. Economic institutions and processes. While a lot of this are generative processes, still a lot of the economy sets the framework for what goes on in cities. You have to be careful in not projecting contemporary economic models into the past where they don't necessarily apply. And I was taken to task by the Socialist Labor Party for portraying the Aztecs like the Flintstones, attributing modern capitalist practices to ancient peoples. This is in response to an article I had in Scientific American where I talked about Aztec markets and money. And so they sent me a copy of their newsletter here. And so I fired back a reply, which they were kind enough to print. Professor Smith protests the people's critique. The fact that the Aztecs had money, markets, and merchants did not make them a capitalist economy because land and labor were not commodities. And then, of course, they had a final word after this and they dumped on what I said. But the key thing here is, what are the nature of commercial institutions? So here's a bunch of commercial institutions in sort of pre-modern economies. And this is supposed to be, it's more or less a Gutman scale, meaning, well, if you take the Aztecs here, had marketplaces for goods and services. If you have marketplaces like that, then you probably have all of the things below it. Counting systems, professional merchants, but you don't necessarily have the things above it. And so this is a scale of commercialization. At the very bottom for ancient states would be dynastic Egypt and the Incas. These were non-commercial economies, command economies that did not have money, markets, and merchants. And shops is one example. Commercial economies have shops. Usually small rooms facing onto the street, often attached to a residence. If they've been well excavated, we might have remains of balances or something related to commercial activity. Non-commercial economies, Egypt, South America, Teotihuacan don't have these shops. Another kind of a top-down institution, social class and wealth inequality. So I'm just going to illustrate this here. Social classes, look at where the red box is. I've taken several sites in Mesoamerica, as well as Bali, just because I had that information from my book. Commoner houses are set at the size of one. And how much bigger is a noble house than a commoner house, or the palace of a king, or the palace of an emperor? And this says something about class structure. In the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, noble houses were 92 times as big as commoner houses. And the imperial palace was 980 times as big. So social class. Let's get to generative processes, bottom-up processes, actions of people working together or interacting socially apart from the state or institutional control. It's often useful to look at two types of generative processes: grassroots activity and spontaneous order or self-coordination. And these are nicely discussed in this paper by Maroney et al. From a couple of years ago. So grassroots activity, neighborhood associations, community organizations, political protests, advocacy activity. I was going to put a slide here. I forgot to do it. Every Christmas, my block organizes itself and we put out luminaria, these bags with candles in them. It's a custom from the state of New Mexico here that someone started, and our block does it. And it's a grassroots kind of thing. Grassroots activities usually portrayed as, as something positive and nice, and it's in the community, and isn't it wonderful? Oops, unless it's Nazis and white supremacists, then it's the wrong kind of grassroots activity. Self-coordination, this is energized crowding. This is the results of interaction. People aren't deliberately trying to bring about changes in their interactions necessarily. And also invisible hand processes. So Friedrich Hayek talked about information being decentralized in a society. And so decisions are best made by those with local knowledge rather than a central authority. Now, he's sort of known as one of the original free market fundamentalists, and planning is bad. But as Sam Bowles pointed out in the paper, his insights about the distributed nature of information don't logically lead to his conclusions about free market fundamentalism. So generative processes at the community level, creation of community, more livable communities, self-determination, economic benefits, both kinds of generative process, but they're difficult to do with archaeological data. Creation of community, I'm going to go fairly quickly through these because I don't know, I typically put too many things in a talk. I think I did that tonight. All cities have neighborhoods, the creation of communities. Robert Sampson, a sociologist, studied neighborhoods in Chicago and other cities. The neighborhood's a unit of analysis in its own right. It has its own properties. More livable communities, Christopher Alexander, Bessim Hakim, the new urbanism. The generative processes develop out of traditional cultural values and produce more livable communities. Self-determination in informal settlements. Colin Ward and John Turner talk about how informal settlements, people have quite a bit of latitude in determining their own activities. Economic benefits of communities. Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize for showing that communities can exploit common pool resources more sustainably than do markets or states. Robert Netting, smallholder intensive agriculture is a productive and sustainable, and the urban scaling results are along here too. So I'm going to change gears a bit here. And I just thought of this in the shower last night, so I put these slides in, thought this would be a good place to get some feedback from you guys. How does urban design and the built environment affect urban success? Well, what do I mean by that? I've been thinking about how early cities might contribute to knowledge of urban adaptations and urban adaptations to climate change and to other stresses today. And so I published this paper, came out a couple of months ago, Urban Success and Urban Adaptation Over the Long Run, where cities adapt to environments, institutions, and so on through shocks, and 3 measures of success: persistence, population, and prosperity. So the idea here is, if we look at the early cities that archaeologists and historians have documented, some of them lasted 10 years and some of them lasted, 4,000 years. What's the difference? Why do some cities last so much longer than others? You can't really tell that from studying cities today because we don't have the time and depth. But archaeologists have the cities, we have the information, but we haven't really done very much to answer questions like this. Persistence, some cities lasted an awfully long time. This is just a sort of an informal, we grabbed a bunch of cities and graphed them. Some of them lasted an awfully long time. Publish a paper on how this persistence relates to urban sustainability in Proceedings to the National Academy of Sciences a few years ago. This, I don't have a citation here. The paper just came out in the journal Antiquity. We had 7 cases around the world of, these are regional archaeological surveys And these are graphs of how long individual settlements lasted, right? Site count and how many years. So the Yautepec Valley, which is the blue graphs at the bottom there, that's circled just because, I don't know, because I directed that project. Persistence was more than 300 years. And this thing is actually blocking my screen here. Oh, sorry. Now I'm screwed. There. 370 years. That's the median length of occupation of a settlement, as opposed to the Santa Valley in Peru, it was only 67 years. How do we explain these differences? The second feature of the success model is population. Population growth is generally a model of success, although in the world today with degrowth and climate change, population growth is not, maybe it may not be the same measure of success, but certainly in the ancient world it was. And resilient cities can be affected by shocks and stresses, and then continue to develop. Types of shocks, lots of shocks. See, any city that lasted, let's say, 1,000 years in the past must have survived quite a few shocks. Okay, whether political, economic, environmental, social, whatever. Must have found ways to survive stresses and shocks. That's sort of the rationale for trying to look at ancient cities in this way. Settlement trajectories, some theories predict that cities should grow logistically, right? They start like on the graph at the left here, growing exponentially, and then they level off as carrying capacity is reached. But a lot of these ancient cities, their growth is sort of like this, and then they drop off. I mean, here's 5 cities where we have pretty good demographic data. Teotihuacan, Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, in all these, Rome, but these dropped off after a while. Constantinople, London under the Romans, and later on these grew quite a bit. So some of the things that we can do with looking at the growth of cities. So if the population is dropping precipitously, that would not be a measure of urban success. Rome was not successful in the 5th century. Okay, when it was dropping in population. Now, later, of course, in recent century or two, it has become very successful in terms of population. Prosperity. Something archaeologists are starting to be able to measure prosperity and things like quality of life. And so this is from the City Prosperity Index of UN Habitat. And archaeologists can document several of these features, 3 or 4 of them, depending on the particular context. So here's my question for you guys. How are urban design and the built environment implicated in long-term urban success? Okay, if we're archaeologists are trying to figure out why some cities were successful over a long period of time and others were not, what is the built environment and what does the design of cities have to do with this? Do traditions of informal and vernacular buildings last longer than top-down civic architecture? I don't mean individual buildings, right? A temple is generally going to last longer than a shack, but traditions of vernacular architecture often last for a long period of time. And civic architecture, well, that may, the styles may not last. I don't know. I don't know the answer to these questions. Do settlements that are more centrally planned have a longer or a shorter lifespan than others? I have no idea. Are the forces that affect settlement persistence in the past and the present radically different? In some ways, they're probably quite different. Cities today can get food from all over the world, transport costs, there's this whole variety of sort of things relating to energy and technology that are very different. But other things are more similar between cities in the past and cities today. So I would be very interested to get your perspective on questions like this. And what I've been going for sort of fast here. I took out a whole section, but I don't know. I suppose I could go through the other section. What do you think I should do? But let me just tell you what the other section was talking about, using spatial patterns to infer the level and degree of central planning. And I just had a bunch of plans, and I don't have anything great to say about it, but just some interesting things. So, what do you think? Should we talk about some of these issues?
I think proceed and talk about some of those issues, if you would, Mike.
Yeah. Oh, you mean go through the plans, or?
Yeah, go through the plans.
Okay, let's go through. All right. Okay. In a number of villages, I mean, this is Amazonian villages, no state societies, they're not urban, seem to have very much regularity. But then you have the issue of the regularity of an ideal plan versus the reality, which is not quite as geometric as the ideal plan. Or you have this case, the real and the ideal in Bhaktapur. Bhaktapur, the priests were told investigators that the city was laid out like a mandala, and here's the mandala, and that's, well, that doesn't really look like that, does it? It looks really crazy. But if you look at the structure of ritual places and processions around the city, there's a concentric pattern, and it does start to resemble the mandala. And okay, here, top-down forces create a settlement, and then generative forces take over. Examples of new urbanism, internment camps, Olympus. What I mean here, Japanese American internment camps. This is a city as practical machine, and Lynch's fund. This was set up by, top-down process. But once it was set up and people moved in, people had a lot of freedom. And this is a graduate student of mine, wrote a very interesting dissertation on these settlements, historical archaeology, April Camp Whitaker, and then generated neighborhoods and social cohesion and spatial patterns that flourished in spite of the top-down creation of these settlements. Or Olympus in Greece, this is extremely geometric, extremely orthogonal. And these houses were probably almost all identical when they started. Then people started moving the walls around and making shops out of some of them, and they ended up all being quite different. So once the central planning was done, then people were moving things around and adjusting things and making adjustments. Or generative forces create a settlement, and then top-down forces are introduced, such as regularization of informal settlements. Or in Burning Man, the Burning Man festival in the desert, began as a campfire on the beach in California. They moved to the desert in Nevada, and it grew each year, and it became chaotic. And it got to a certain point where it was being too chaotic, and people were driving around and knocking down tents and shooting off guns and all. And it was on federal land, and the Fed said, you've got to get your organization together. And so in 1996, they introduced planning. All overnight, this place was planned. And then they used circular planning, and this is what it looks like. And there were just too many people to have an unplanned settlement. And so planning was introduced, and there's a whole department of urban planning at Burning Man. And there's a lot of room for research here. Forced planning. This is a missionary setting in Eastern Africa, where the original village settlement was not at all centrally planned or orthogonal. The missionary sort of made people live in a much more planned orthogonal setting. But it's sometimes hard to say what is the level of planning in a settlement. So this is a residential area in Amarna, Akhenaten's capital in Egypt, that was built in a hurry. And Egyptologists said, some of them said, well, this is obviously centrally planned, and others said, no, it's not. And here's a simulation model, not of Amarna, but basically a simulated settlement based on certain rules. You build a house next to another house, you got to have some streets and so on. And it's very similar to the kind of structure. at Amarna. Here's 4 hilltop cities in Mesoamerica. They're all sort of political capitals on the top of the hills. You see 2 of them, Xochicalco, Monte Alban, major ceremonial districts at the top of the hill. And then people were living on terraces going down the sides of the hills. And it's interesting that the difference in the patterns, the 2 Oaxaca settlements, Monte Alban and El Palmillo, they're very small terraces, almost certainly built by the people who lived there. It's not centrally planned. People sort of building their own little terraces, as opposed to Xochicalco, where the terraces run for miles. Literally, they run entirely around the hill, and they almost certainly were centrally planned. And the houses were then, set out on these terraces with a certain level of planning. The civic architecture, the red squares are what the archaeologist thinks were sort of neighborhood centers. Calixtlahuaca, which is the site I worked at, has terraces, but they are sort of segments with sort of 3 sides. And one of the features that suggests sort of central construction is that there's also these drains at the site, because too much rain in the rainy season can cause the terraces to fall down, so the drains, take the water out in the rainy season. And so it's sort of intermediate between the Oaxaca situation and Xochicalco in terms of how people are setting up terraces and whether they're centrally planned or not. And I guess that's it. I am going to stop my sharing.
Okay, thanks, Mike. There's an awful lot to chew on there. There's questions from you to us, and there's also going to be questions from us to you, I think. So I'll open it up for discussion. There will be some questions on Zoom, but first of all, to questions in the room. And I'll ask you, if you're in the room, please press your microphone button, make it green while you're talking. And if you're on Zoom, please unmute yourself while you're asking the question. Any questions in the room? Yes.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. I was wondering the role that, in a way, the resources and just the natural landscape that the cities were therein played a role in their long-term survival. But I guess, I don't know if that contributes to any discussion here, or is it a sideline thing and we're only discussing how the organic form versus the planned form play a role. But for example, in some settlements, you showed that the collective spatial forms were located on high points and are very strategically placed sometimes, most times, near the water. And then the way that the city interacts with the natural resources limits the growth of a city to a certain extent. I don't know your views on that, maybe.
Well, yeah. Of course, the environmental setting in the paper we published in Antiquity, where we had the 7 archaeological surveys, we found that in environmental settings with higher productivity for agriculture, the settlements tended to last longer. That's in comparing regions in the world. So in desert settings, they didn't last as long. And then I think within an individual region, yeah, some cities have a better agricultural base, or a better location with respect to rivers or sea trade. So yeah, that's an important factor at several levels. Yeah.
Any others in the room? Yep.
Hi, Michael. Thank you very much for this fascinating presentation. I think what I'm really interested is, I believe many of us work with urban informality, contemporary urban informality. And I think we also deal with some of these interpretations of urban morphology and how do we see cities from the top. and how do we try to connect that to the local practices that are happening. Was wondering if you could share a little bit more about how do we interpret, because very often archaeologically, I imagine you would have access to the top down, to the large scale archaeological remains, to maybe paintings or historical records that are made by governments.
Yes.
But you don't have the details of the daily life of people with that much detail. So just wondered if you could share a little bit more about how can we learn about the daily practices, and maybe those are some insights that we could think about our research as well.
Well, that's where this focus on households and neighborhoods is important. And so by excavating households, by excavating houses, we can learn about the sort of activities and conditions of the people who live there. In some settings, like, I don't know, most of the sites I've excavated, where what's nice is that people threw their trash out back. They didn't collect the garbage, and we might call them slobs. But what it meant was you could dig outside of a house and find the remains of things that those people, you know, the bones of the animals that they ate. You could find the kinds of pottery vessels they had, the stone tools that they had. And so one of the things that I learned, and I was very surprised, my first excavation of these houses in the 80s was that people were doing very well economically. I came to that project expecting that people would be downtrodden because the state was important and they'd been conquered by the Aztec Empire. And it turns out that they had lots of imported goods. They had valuable goods, and they weren't sort of poor and downtrodden. And so that gives us some idea of sort of the economic conditions at these houses. So by working on excavating houses and reconstructing household sort of activities and conditions, I think is the way to approach the bottom-up kinds of processes.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take a question from Zoom, which is from Shafat Nawaz, and he's typed it out, so I'll read it. On the thought whether what causes today's cities to persist longer than other cities, I want to take your opinion on the bazaar, a bottom-up economic mode of organization which has historically persisted. Do you think that the bazaar economy is more adaptive and resilient than the firm economy? I presume that means the corporate economy. Should cities promote the bazaar economy to avoid ordeals of shrinkage like Detroit or Cleveland?
Well, I mean, that's a good observation. And I mean, it's a different kind of a thing from, I don't know what you call the firm economy. I mean, a bazaar is a form of commercial activity that's very localized, and it's very much a generative kind of process. And I mean, we have in Mexico, where I do research, we have marketplaces like this, and the markets, you know, some towns have a market to meet every day, some towns have a market to meet once a week. And this is very persistent, and it's a different kind of organization from the sort of national capitalist economy. And how does that contribute to persistence of cities? I don't know. That's a good question, but it's certainly a dynamic aspect of urban life. And I don't know how far back it goes in the various parts of the world, but it's certainly a major part of generative processes in these cities. So, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to throw one in here, Mike. I've also got a stab at an answer to your question, but I'll put my question first, which is that it's clear that density, partly from the scaling and other things that you've said, that density brings a whole lot of benefits, but it also brings a whole lot of problems. I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about what those benefits are, the benefits of density and the problems of density.
Well, in terms of benefits of density, what I've worked with the scaling analysis is that what the urban scaling has shown is that density is then associated with increased economic productivity. And it's not just more productive than less dense cities, it's more productive per capita. So for example, someone had data on the number of rock bands in cities in the United States and Canada. And larger cities had more rock bands than smaller cities, but it wasn't just more rock bands, they had more rock bands per capita. So the density has economic effects that go beyond just the number of people, intensive economic effects as opposed to extensive just because there's more people. So the density definitely has major effects in economic productivity.
So just on that, Mike, can I ask, is it because the guitarists go to the city or because the city produces guitarists?
Well, I think both. I would guess both.
Okay. And the problems of density, the other side of that question.
Well, stress and crime and poverty, you know, these are all things that sort of the negative outcomes of density in many parts of the world. And as an archaeologist, it's more difficult to identify these in the archaeological record. I mean, a lot of my colleagues are hesitant to even estimate population of sites, much less talk about density. And so if we can get density out of ancient sites, we're doing pretty well, but to get to the negative effects and then positive effects is much more difficult.
Any other questions? Yeah, Matt.
Thanks again for the presentation, Michael. The question you had on vernacular buildings was particularly interesting to me, and partly because we see in contemporary discussions of urban resilience an emergence of thinking about how vernacular ideas or quote unquote ancient technologies, if I can use those terms, might provide a more light footprint and robust response to many of the ecological and social challenges that cities face today. What can you glean from your work and your observations about that contention and how vernacular technologies might or might not be more responsive to the factors of place?
Well, in the area of traditional agricultural methods, there's a number of cases where traditional methods that have just about died out have been sort of reintroduced. I'm thinking of raised field cultivation in South America in particular. It's a very productive agricultural method, and it's definitely, you know, small scale technology, low capital kind of system. And as for the advantages, the advantages of vernacular architecture, you know, there's climatic adaptations and just, you know, the cost and self-build and so on. But it's hard to do at a large scale, right? It's hard to do at a large scale and in a dense setting.
Crystal.
Thanks, Mike, for your presentation. I just wanted to kind of return to the question you asked us to consider, because I'm really interested to hear what others have to say about that. I'm not myself an urban designer, but my understanding of the question is, how is urban design implicated in long-term urban success?
Yeah.
And given sort of the dialectic relationship between the informal and formal that you kind of like painted out over the course of the presentation, I wonder if it's both and, you know, just thinking a little bit about the whole sort of pandemic experience and the ways in which like tactical urbanism, which was seen as sort of a way of self-organizing, you know, an informal way of reclaiming streets from cars in some instances, was then repurposed as a way of extending street life at a time when much of us were locked in. So I can see urban design playing a really crucial role long-term, but I'm kind of just using that as a seed to hear what others have to say about urban design and the question that Mike posed to us. Might be looking at Kim or Merritt here.
Do you want to have a go at that, Mike, or do you want to hear my answer? Okay, I'll give you my answer, which is that urban design is a key to how we manage the problems and the opportunities of density, because urban design makes the key decisions about how people will live and how they will interface with public space. And it largely controls the way in which people meet face to face, which is the degree to which crowding is energized or not, under what conditions. So that all of those morphological issues about building height and type and the street width and so on, which are so crucial, that are kind of largely urban design. In many ways, I see urban planning as almost identified with the top down, that it's, I understand, you and I know we both agree that it's wrong to simply refer to these other cities as somehow unplanned, because there is a kind of there's bottom up planning and there's top down planning. But the urban planning profession has a history of, in a sense, almost was invented to manage the excesses of density and of informality. So I mean, I don't have an answer as to about what the urban design should be. I just believe that that's its role, is to manage density, is to extract those benefits by bringing us into ad hoc contact through this energized crowding, which I'd never noticed this when I originally read Spiro Kostov, but it's a lovely phrase. Anyway, that's my crude answer. It's over to you again, Mike, to tell us your answer.
Well, I often use the phrase central planning to talk about the kind of top-down thing we're talking about. Of course, everything is planned, and because behavior is intentional, people don't behave randomly and do crazy things all the time. But it's sort of what social and spatial level is that planning taking place? I mean, people plan things on the level of the household. But doesn't produce central planning. And this gets into the question I see that's in the chat about what an alternative word for organic cities. And I tend to use, rather than saying planned and unplanned, I'd say not centrally planned. I don't know if that's a great way to do it, or a generative I mean, in a sense, unplanned sounds like planning is the normal thing, and then somewhere unplanned they're weird. But really, you know, a lack of central planning is probably the normal human experience over the millennia, and so centrally planned settlements are sort of the exception.
But there's a problem in defining something according to what it's not, isn't there?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, just wanted to add a point to that conversation. I find it really strikes some chords with me. I am originally from Brasilia, which is in itself an important case study on that. And usually it is a city regarded as a failure because of so much central planning, right? I've followed very closely what happened during the pandemic in Brasilia, and yeah, the central government in Brazil was a total disaster. But I saw my parents living in Brasilia were very happy. They had access to green. They could go into their cars, don't see anyone, do groceries, come back home. So I guess there is always that conversation of what exactly is success and what are we preparing ourselves for, and what is the central government planning for, I guess, as well. So I think that that's just interesting points. And the organic or the bottom-up organization was seen as negative in that sense. In that particular context, when people wanted to gather in the streets, they were prohibited. So I think that also, I wonder, Michael, if you could tell us a little bit more about central planned cities in the past, what evidence we have of success, maybe beyond just population growth. Are there any other metrics that could be used?
Well, persistence, how long they lasted. The Greek and Roman cities, a lot of them were centrally planned. Roman cities in Britain lasted for a while and then they were abandoned and took a long time for urbanism to get growing again in Britain after the Romans left. But that wasn't the fault of the cities. It wasn't, it was the empire. It was the larger political forces. In Mesoamerica, where I work, very few cities are extensively planned. I mean, Teotihuacan, and there's a few that have a major grid, but like Tikal I showed is more typical. You have a central area where there's some planned layout of the civic buildings, and then you have the sort of generative patterns of residences surrounding that. But as to which lasts longer, I mean, it turns out that it's actually, archaeologists have not put a lot of effort into looking at how long settlements lasted and how the length of time they lasted might relate to other factors. It's really sort of a new kind of thing. And it's so new that the National Science Foundation wouldn't fund us to continue this project. So
I think this is our time is up, and I think this is a good time to call it to a conclusion. I want to thank everyone for for coming along and for your questions. I would just add, Anitra has put into the chat that maybe we call it generatively planned cities. But again, I want to thank you all for coming along. I especially want to thank Michael Smith for staying up so late to entertain us in this way and to raise so many really interesting cities. This is the last of our seminars in the first half of this year. There'll be another series in the second half. There'll be more publicity about that. This one has been recorded and a link will be placed on our website within a few days. You can find that if you just plug the word InfUr, INFUR, into Google, it will find us. And other than that, say thank you again to all of you and to Michael Smith. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. I appreciate the coming to my talk and to the discussion here. So, thanks. So now it's 10 o'clock here, which means it's time for me to go let the dog out for his final.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.